Regulation of the heart. There are two types of regulation of the heart. First one is intrinsic regulation, and the second one is the extrinsic regulation. With intrinsic regulation, you're looking at the heart itself, determining the heart rate and the force of contraction. With extrinsic regulation, you're going to be looking at things outside of the heart. Something outside of the heart influences the heart rate and the blood pressure. Intrinsic regulation is basically going to depend on venous return. In venous return, or the definition of venous return, this is the amount of blood returned to the heart from the veins. Okay, so let's erase some of this so I can have a little bit of room, and we'll be talking about intrinsic regulation. Intrinsic regulation depends on venous return, and the definition of venous return is the amount of blood returned to the heart from the veins. Okay, intrinsic regulation is going to be the heart itself determining the heart rate and blood pressure. So whenever you have a ventricle, it's going to be shaped kind of like this right here. This would be the inferior portion of the heart, the two ventricles. And if you increase venous return, the ventricle is going to stretch, so it's going to be bigger. It's going to get larger to accommodate that extra blood. So our dotted line there represents the size of the ventricles whenever you have an increase in venous return. Okay, so the first part of Starling's law. Starling's law states that when the heart receives more blood, it stretches to accommodate the extra blood. Okay, the second part of Starling's law, we'll draw it like in another color. Let's do it in red. The second part of Starling's law says that whenever the heart is stretched, it's going to recoil with a greater force. So we have our solid line there showing that a certain amount of blood has been returned to the heart. Well, this solid line here represents the size of the ventricle after it is contracted and pushed that blood out of the heart. We have our dotted line, and that is showing, or that represents the size of the heart whenever it has received more blood from the veins, or as venous return is increased. So here's our dotted line showing the size of the ventricle after contraction if venous return has increased. So you can see that if more blood goes to the heart stretches, it accommodates that extra blood, and then it's going to recoil with a greater force. If you remember in class, we had those examples of the balloon and the rubber band. And that's going to be intrinsic regulation. Let me take 1 second to draw that just again. So I'm going to erase all of this. And real fast recap it. Okay, so this is the size of the heart whenever you have normal circulation. In other words, normal circulation in this example here is going to be saying you're at rest. Okay, that's the size of the heart whenever you're at rest and it is in diastole. This is the size of the heart at the end of systole. Okay, so there's the size. Now we're going to say we're going to have the size of the heart whenever you have an increase in venous return. Just so you know, increase in venous return is going to occur whenever you are exercising. So that kind of gives you an idea of rest and exercise. So this is going to be the end diastolic volume whenever you have an increase in venous return. And the ventricles are going to recoil with a greater force, so they're going to recoil, and the end systolic volume is going to be even less. So when do you exercise? When venous return increases. Okay, you know that when venous return increases, that means more blood goes to the heart. This is going to increase the end diastolic volume, so it's going to fill the ventricles up more, and it's going to decrease the end systolic volume, which means that it's going to empty the ventricles more. Okay, now let's look at extrinsic regulation. With extrinsic regulation, something outside of the heart regulates it. Regulates the heart rate and the blood pressure, or it can influence it at minimum. So we're going to switch colors here. Okay, extrinsic regulation. The medulla. Medulla is going to be where the regulatory center for heart rate and blood pressure are located. Okay, the medulla has several other regulatory centers, but specifically for the heart, it's going to have the location for the heart rate and the blood pressure. If the medulla sees that, I'm going to give you an example here. If the medulla sees that you have a high blood pressure and it needs to be lowered, then the medulla is going to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. How does the medulla stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system? It stimulates the vagus nerve. Remember, the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve that is going to influence all the parasympathetic information in your thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay, let's go over and give another example. And we're going to say that this time it's going to have too low of a blood pressure for your activity. The medulla is going to read that and says that it wants to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. If the medulla stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to tell the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are going to increase the heart rate and increase the blood pressure. Okay, when would the medulla decide that it needs to influence heart rate or blood pressure? When does the medulla need to influence heart rate and blood pressure? Well, actually, it does it quite a bit. I'm going to erase intrinsic regulation because we're through with it. Okay, there's two basic and main ways that the medulla is going to influence heart rate and blood pressure. Okay, the first one is by baroreceptors. The second one is chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors are going to detect the stretch of a blood vessel. They're located in the aorta